Other Worlds discussion panel. I'm going to be the moderator. My name is David DeKay. Before we get started, I'm going to do a brief introduction of all our panelists today, which we thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this afternoon. First, we have Dean Farrell. Dean Farrell's books, plays, and articles have won local, national, and international awards. His series, Cryptic Spaces, has won 4 national awards, and he recently published a children's book, Don't Look Under the Stairs, with Disney animator Thomas Levitt. He has spent time in Scotland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Bermuda, and all over the United States, and lives in Jacksonville, Florida. He loves to write stories that give a sense of wonder and adventure. Thank you for joining us, Dean. Andrew Seddon. A native of England, Andrew Seddon has over 150 publication credits, including 15 books, and enjoys writing in the genres of science, supernatural, and historical fiction, as well as nonfiction. He is a member of the SFWA and the Authors Guild, and when not writing, he can be found hiking, enjoying classical music, and running marathons. Good for him. And lives in Florida with his wife Olivia and German Shepherds, Rex and Baltazar. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. Valerie Willis. Valerie Willis, also writing under the names V.C. Willis and Honey Cummings, is the COO of Four Horsemen Publications, Inc., an expert digital typesetter and a fantasy romance author based out of Central Florida. She loves crafting novels with elements inspired by mythology, legends, folklore, fairy tale, and history. As COO, she oversees the design of all books, including covers, typesets, and author branding, where she pulls in creative print design while making versatile ebooks. Thank you for joining us, Valerie. And Rachel Thompson. Rachel Thompson began working in journalism after surviving a near-death accident in 2003. She writes quirky sci-fi, social satire, and historical fiction twisted into new shapes, as well as short stories, nonfiction, and cartoons that have appeared in anthologies, newspapers, and magazines. She has 5 self-published novels and 1 anthology, with more books on the way. She lives and writes in the Ocala National Forest. Thank you for joining us, Rachel. So the format of today's panel, I'm going to ask each of our participating authors a question, and they'll have an opportunity to respond, and then I'll give each of the other panelists an opportunity to add their thoughts to the question, but preferably not going too long on that one because they're going to get their own question. And if we have time at the end, have some bonus content, as you were.
That's when we all get naked.
Thank God we're recording.
I didn't wear the right socks.
So we'll start with Rachel. Rachel, what is world building, and what does that term mean to you?
Well, I can speak on that for 4 hours, but
Well, how about 10 minutes?
I'll speak for just a minute or two.
Okay.
To me, world building is characterization. I build worlds to suit the characters and the story that I need. I've done everything from ancient historical fiction to 10 million years into the future, which is my current book. And what I tend to do is use setting in such a way that it exemplifies the character and supports the story. I don't create settings out of nowhere. For me, a setting has to do double or triple duty. I use settings and or world building techniques for the purpose of supporting the character, of course. So I usually build worlds to suit, but that doesn't stop me from building worlds that everybody knows, because as a reader or as an author, everybody doesn't know everything about every place. So, for example, my new book takes place or starts in the 1950s in Pennsylvania, quickly moves to the Haight-Ashbury, where my main character is socialized and becomes who he is. But I try to exemplify the feeling and the sense of what the Haight-Ashbury was about in description, but also for the purpose of him, to exemplify him and how he fit into it, because I created this personality through his experiences in the Haight-Ashbury. I wasn't there, I'm not that old. I had to research the living daylights out of it to really understand it well. But it was all, that setting, that world building even, is all for the purpose of creating a character that seemed real and feasible for a person in the environment that he's in. And I'll stop there because I can keep going.
Well, I'll jump in. The great filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein once said that perceiving is building. And as we perceive the world, we rebuild it every day. And I think that that's my perspective about world building, is that we're always involved in world building, whether we love science fiction or romance or whether we just like, taking a walk around the block. We're still perceiving the world and rebuilding it as we do that.
Maybe slightly the opposite, because I tend to think of the idea for a story and how it's going to be set, and then think, what do I want my main character to be, to do, and what kind of a person do I want to insert into this world.
I often do that too.
But they're inextricable, I think, the setting and the characters.
Yeah, you can't detach them. Sometimes I have the character first, and I have to build the world to suit the character. Sometimes the concept comes into mind, and I already have the world because the concept fits in the world, but then I have to build a character to exemplify the concept. So it depends on what comes first, yeah. But they all have to mesh, like so.
And I guess my 2 cents on this is everyone's different when it comes to writing and creating new worlds. Like, if you look at historical writers, Tolkien had a language, and then he built a world for his languages because he's doing linguistics. It really depends how we ground ourselves in our own world, and then usually that's what takes root for fictional variants.
Excellent, thank you. All right, the next question is for Valerie. Why is world building important to a story? Can you give an example of a successful world from a popular movie franchise? Why was it successful?
I think our biggest one that I think we've all felt the impact of is Harry Potter, right? I think most successful world building really inspires the human element inside it. And this is something I believe James Campbell talks about when it comes to mythology and why these everlasting stories and heroes' journey lasted so long, is that human element, right? So when you take a franchise like Harry Potter, who has really fleshed out all the different aspects. They've defined what low class and high class look like. They've divided, and it mimics real society quite a bit. And then you go over to something more fantastical, so Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's worlds, they do the same thing, right? We know what a low class person there, it mimics, it has economy, it kind of dives into all the facets of the things, and then moves it in a direction that amplifies the genre. And of course, the most common one that's happening right now that's really great world building is all of those spin-offs of the Star Wars. You didn't have to be part of what was going on in the initial trilogy. Mandalorian kind of shares that story with us, that there was other planets and other things unfolding elsewhere at all times. So it's the whole idea that even when you're not chasing your main characters, the world is still living and breathing around them, whether they're there or not. That's a sign of a good world building.
Awesome. Dean, go ahead.
I'll jump in. One of my favorites for world building is the Hunger Games, and I think that good world building comes out of an emotional experience that we've had, or that we're having, or that we're facing as a culture or as a people, and that's what I think gives that film power. Is anyone that's experienced hunger, that's experienced the political system that seems unable to address some of the problems that we're currently facing, they have that frustration that you feel, and that helps to create that world, and that world becomes very real to us because we can understand it on an emotional level.
Andrew, you have any thoughts?
I'm not a big movie watcher.
No? Okay. Can you answer the first part? Why do you think that world building is important to a story?
World building is important because that's where your characters are going to live and act and breathe and move. And to, and you can have worlds where the emphasis is on the characters. You can also have worlds where the emphasis is more on the science and the actual world itself. I don't know if anybody remembers the works of Hal Clement, who was one of the masters of hard science fiction. And he would take it the other way. He'd have a world with high gravity or a world that was with ice, and then put characters into those situations. But a lot of it, the focus was on the actual physics and the mechanics of living in such a world. Whereas others, you get more the character-driven, where you put a person into a society, an environment, and see how they cope with it, overcome whatever challenges they have, that sort of thing.
Great, thank you.
I would add, one thing about movies as opposed to writing is that the movie provides the physical world building. And of course, in fiction, you have to create the physical world as well as the social aspects of world building. So there's a distinction. In books, you have to sort of explain it all, but you don't want to belabor the reader and show them things they already know. So it's a razor's edge to walk. You want to give them enough description so they can see the place, but you don't want to overburden them. With movies, the place is made for you. You see it right in front of you. So in some way, in my mind, it's more difficult in movies to use the setting or use the world to help characterize. Very often we as authors will choose our setting and what we see in the setting as an extra layer of things for the character to consider. But Aragon walking across the fields where the horses were, we know what a field looks like. We don't have to, but we can then see his emotional response to it, which in that case, in the Lord of the Rings movie, there is none. But if you read the book, when they're hiding from the Rohirrim coming by, they're going through their own internal conflicts about it. Do we stand up? Do we not? You don't see that so much in the story when it's conveyed because it just happens. But in the book, there's a debate going on. So, the book takes you deeper. It doesn't take you deeper in what you see, but it has to take you deeper in what's presented physically. There's no way around it. Movie does it for you.
Yeah, I think movies are an imperfect analogy, but I chose it because I thought there's a higher chance that everyone would be familiar with a movie than picking a book. So, excellent. Thank you for your contribution there. So the next question will be for Andrew. What are the key factors for those writers who have had success in world building?
The key factors that cause them to have success? Well, there's a bunch of key factors. One, I think, is the characterization. I think it's important to have characters that we can relate to in one way or another. Second is actually the coherence of the world. If you're writing a straight hard science fiction novel and suddenly throw in some magic in the middle, it's jarring and out of place. The other is the actual prose itself. I'm sure we've all read books where the story was good, but the writing wasn't, for one reason or another.
Can you elaborate a little more on that? What do you mean by the prose as part of the world building?
Well, you have to avoid the tendency, for one thing, to do what are called info dumps, where you've got page after page of exposition of explaining something, whereas it more realistically should be kind of worked in a more natural fashion. I've read some books where the author uses the same phrase over and over and over, so you want to tear your hair out. I remember one book I read where the heroine was biting her lip every third page, and I was kind of wondering when she would ever run out of lip to bite. That kind of thing.
I think you've hit on an important point there that especially a lot of new writers struggle with is, especially with world building and building a narrative, is to show, not tell. What are some techniques that you use as an experienced writer to kind of get over that hurdle? One of the common things you'll see is maybe a phrase like, Joe was excited, or Joe was anxious. Instead of actually showing us what Joe's reaction to the situation was. Joe dropped his coffee cup because he was surprised, or Joe broke out in a sweat in sudden fear, or his heart skipped. Something more descriptive than actually just saying, Joe had this feeling. I'd like to hear from all the panelists on that, because I think that's a good point.
Consistency is a big key. And I think another aspect that you see in successful world building from others is that your world is almost its own character. So when your characters are evolving and developing and changing, their world should also be changing, because we as real people, we know our world changes every day. Our earthquake at any given moment can shift thousands. The pandemic and COVID is a prime example, right? So our world doesn't always conform to what our characters want to do or what we want to do, and you kind of got to mimic that a little bit in your work. But at the same point, yes, you have to stay consistent, and your prose can be a lot of things. The showing and telling and the info dump go hand in hand. Usually an info dumper is also doing more telling than showing. So for example, they start off the story, Tom Rodden was part of controversy because he was a new race car driver from Italy. Instead, you can show him getting ready to go to the club, and he's overhearing a news report of the controversy, and he's like, screw this, I'm going out. And you're like, oh, this guy's bad news. Like, you don't need to tell us this whole dramatic, monologue about him being a notorious bad boy. You can just show us him getting ready for a night, and he's on the radio, and he's like, oh, I better turn this off. I'm here to have a good time. I've already dealt with that today. So there's a lot of fun ways you can incorporate it and have your characters kind of impose their feelings about their own world to your readers a little bit more.
I think the comment about change is very important, because our characters do need to learn to grow. Something has to happen to them during the course of the book.
Well, getting back to world building in prose, to me, the ones who are most successful and do the best world building, and it doesn't matter who they are, they can be fantasy authors. The best fantasy authors do not belabor it. I think the most important thing is to be concise, get to it, and explain it, and of course, show it. You can't get away from exposition. You got to have it. You got to pick your battles, when to do exposition and when not to do it. My pet peeve is exposition, not exposition, but info dumping inside dialogue. Don't do that. But you have to do some of it. But most of the information the reader needs to know, if you put it in dialogue, you're not building the world, you're just having people talking. Show the world. Don't let your characters tell you what the world is through dialogue or internal dialogue, or reserve that for exposition if you have to do that. But the important thing is to be concise and get right to and ground your reader where they need to be and what they need to do. If you start a story and the reader doesn't know where they are, then the readers are already lost before you get started. In my mind, the most important thing is to serve the reader, which means serve the story. If you like your flowery language, well, that's distracting the reader from what's really in front of him or what he's really thinking about. So, we all love our chestnuts. We all write lots of beautiful language, and then if we're smart, we'll take most of it out because it's not aiding the reader on their journey to what you want them to see. So concise prose, solid prose, I think is the most important aspect of any author that world builds. Tolkien, great example. Look how he writes. Carl Sagan, read his book Contact. Best, most beautiful prose I ever seen. And he's a science guy. Actually read his science books, same thing. Clear, clean prose. You know exactly where you are, you know exactly what's happening. There's no question in the reader's mind. That's the goal. The reader must understand. Must be able to see what you're trying to convey. You don't want to load it up with fluff. You want to explain in the simplest, easiest way possible, like Shrunken White said, Elements of Style. Keep going back to that book. It's a gold mine.
What was that book?
Shrunken White. It was first published in 1938, and it's still alive and well. It's been updated a few times, but it's called The Elements of Style, and it is a standard. I've never met an editor that didn't have a copy. So it gives you the basics for clean prose, and that's what you don't want to burden your reader. You want your reader to get from point A to point B without tripping. That's what clean prose is about.
When I was early on in my writing career, one of my first drafts of the first book in Cryptic Spaces, I gave it to a friend to read, and I came more from the film and the theater side of things, so I was very heavy on dialogue. And he read it, he said, "This is great, but I like to know where I am when this dialogue is taking place." And you know, in my mind, I knew, you know, I just seeing this whole thing, but the reader wasn't. So I had to go back through and learn how to, you know, and I think it's an art, because to be able to give a sense of place without being information dump where it becomes very very laborious is an art, and it's kind of like being able to ping vistas, where you're able to just hit certain things in a room, and that allows the reader to create in their mind that room or that world or that space. And you know, my book deals with time travel and also deals with interdimensional worlds. So you're dealing with, at the same time, you know, all different kinds of world building, and they have to mesh and they have to work together. So I have to be very careful that I build the immediate world before I build the outside world.
You've hit on an interesting point there. One thing that I see in a lot of sci-fi authors is they'll get so excited about their fantasy world that they've created. You'll get a lot of exposition, info dumping at the beginning of their novel, where they want to tell you about this entire society that they've created before they even get to any of the action. Do you think that tell me your thoughts on what an appropriate level of world building to like narrative action in a novel would be?
That's a really good question. I think it's one that we constantly battle. I've had some people feel like I went too much into the science in some areas of my books, and I've had some tell me that that's what made them love the book more than anything else. When Tolkien first came out with Lord of the Rings, people thought this is, you know, at least some of the people in his area thought this is never going to work because it's so laborious on the world creating side of things. Yet that's what drew people to his work, and that's what made that such a long-term classic is the world. And so I think it's you have to go from your interior. You have to go from your gut as to, you know, what it is, and then get feedback from the readers and kind of work together with those two, because that's a difficult line to make that distinction.
Valerie, how do you try to keep that balance in your writing?
So it comes down to know your audience, right? So there's people who love Tolkien, and then there's people who are like, oh, he talks about is trees. It's just trees for miles. There's trees and walking and trees, and there's more walking and more hiding on trees. You know, and it really comes down to your reader, right? Because clearly Tolkien is a classic. It's stand time. Same thing with Frankenstein. When people read Frankenstein, it's a very different read because she does go into the science of that. And if you're not ready for that when you read it, I don't know if anyone's taken the time to read Frankenstein in its originality, but you can get bored really fast with it, despite everything that's going on with that and what that piece stands for. So you have to come back to the reader that you intend this to read this. Like, I write male romance. I know that that book's not for everybody. You know, and I could read it on y'all's face when you approach me at a table when I introduce my books. I said, okay, this one's not for them, but they like mythology. Let's talk mythology. And you kind of have that in mind, especially when you start doing your revisions. Don't try to do it in your first draft. You will buckle yourself and get writer's block like no tomorrow. Even then, as you world build and describe a scene, remember when you walk in a room, you don't instantly know everything in that room, do you? Your eyes fall someplace, you get distracted, your eyes fall back on another thing, and then you do a double take of like, wait, is that a Gutenberg Bible just sitting up on that podium? I thought it was a Bible, but that's like hold on. You know, you can take time to slowly zoom in, just like you see them do in a movie a little bit, right? You can mention, oh, there's a lot of chairs in there. And then you realize there are chairs in this. There are a lot of broken chairs in this room. You know, you can step it down a little bit and kind of ease yourself into the world building and building the scene out. It doesn't have to be an instant thing. So that would be sort of my take on that.
Just one really funny comment is that I was asked one time to teach English to Koreans, and they used Frankenstein as the book because of the vocabulary in it. And I'm like, and this is their introduction to American literature. I'm like, really?
19th century language is completely different, and I've read tons of 19th century books. You have to gear your head to it. But the thing to remember about fantasy readers and science fiction readers, because of the world building, and readers that like this stuff, myself included, will tolerate more of that. If you're world building and a little more time in world building. But if you are a person that reads Clive Cussler, you're not going to stand for it, because that book is boom, boom, boom. You got 3-page chapters right along. And so, you know, it's like Valerie says, it depends on your reader, but I do believe, and the market will bear this out, that sci-fi and fantasy readers are more tolerant of introductions. And actually, there's a couple of very famous ones who I hate their books. J.K. Rowling, I think her prose is horrible. I read 50 pages and threw it away. But she's writing for 6th grade level, and that's okay. In middle grade and stuff like that, and her books are really children's books, even though everybody loves them. Her prose is, you know, designed for that audience, so to speak. So it's okay, there's some passive language and it's dragged out too much. Young readers maybe are going to tolerate that. But I don't like the way she writes. And Brandon Sanderson, big guy, so many books out there. I picked up one of his the other day. I think all kinds of ly verbs. I don't write, I write fantasy and sci-fi. I don't necessarily write, you know, thrillers and that kind of thing, but I learned a lot from thrillers. I learned how to get to it quicker, you know, so everybody should read everything and take lessons from everywhere. But in the market, sci-fi readers are a little more tolerant, and fantasy readers are a little more tolerant of bad prose because they're after the ideas, and they're more tolerant of slow starts, easing into the world. But I often use the sprinkle the world building in as you go. That's how I like to do it. I don't, unless it's something shocking, special, nobody's ever seen before, like the camera idea. I do this a lot. Got this idea from Stephen King. You start with your camera back here, and when something important happens, you zoom right in, and then we see the details. But your world building is happening all through every process. It's your character interacting with the world is how you convey to the reader what the world is and how it looks. Not because of how it looks, but how the character feels about it. It's not what the character sees, it's what they experience. And a lot of new writers make the mistake of telling the reader what they feel, what the character feels, instead of showing it, whether it's through dialogue, internal dialogue, or exposition, or action. So.
And that's a good point. Like, you also have to remember, you've built a room, right? Let's take this room for instance. And the world is established, but don't forget the influence that you need to have on your reader and character and the emotional exchange of what's happening. Someone could walk in this room, and we feel like we do currently, but if the lights were off and something bad just happened out there and the chairs were disheveled, our feelings about this room and what we perceived as going on changes drastically. Or if we came in and there was Christmas decorations, now we're giving different information. So just the slightest touch of changing a detail, and even when a character circles back and revisits a thing, one of my favorite ways of foreshadow using world building is when they come through a town, and the town's like all happy. He sees a boy playing with his dog. It reminds him of his childhood. He had a happy childhood. Comes back after losing his butt in a battle, and everyone's shutting their shutters. The dogs are missing. Like, bad stuff has happened to both your character and your world. Like I said, you kind of treat it as its own character a little bit, and then you enhance those, and the rest of it falls in place. And remember, when you're writing the science fiction, writing the fantasy, writing the paranormal, or even crime and mystery, your readership has already read this genre. They're coming here to shop. They expect science fiction dump here and there. They're going to expect some explanation of a magic system. They're going to expect a system of paranormal powers or something of the sorts, and allow yourself to kind of give yourself that little establishment of that world.
That's great. I really like 2 points there. I like the idea that the audience for your work is definitely going to give you a little more leeway with your world building and your exposition. I also liked Rachel's point that about thrillers. Even if you're not writing in that genre, I think there's a lot to be learned from at least reading those, or a couple good ones, to learn about pacing and what really keeps driving readers forward. It's really easy to lose the thread sometimes with what keeps a book moving.
Gone Girl is a great one because it's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah,
so what happens when
though.
your lens is taking in the world in a very skewed way? How does that influence you as a reader? So I always recommend that one, again, if you're not a thriller, but just the way that it's executed is very influential.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Dean, what is the most important component of world building, and what's the biggest pothole that new writers need to avoid?
Well, I'm going to have to tell you guys, I'm an energy creativity guy. So being on the world building platform or panel is kind of an interesting experience for me. And it's made me have to think a lot about world building. For me, and in my writing and in my reading and the things I enjoy, I think the biggest plus for world building for me is if it's relatable. If I can relate to the world, if I can, whether it's on an emotional level or on a scientific mental level, or if I can somehow relate to it, then I can put myself in that. I remember a discussion with Ray Bradbury where he said, when I write, I just sit at my typewriter and I watch my characters and try to run behind them and record what they're saying. And that's similar to the process for me. So a lot of times it's more important for me to be watching the world as it's unfolding and trying to keep up with that. I think the biggest pothole that you could possibly get into with world building is to be so enamored with your world that you forget that it's a story about people. And if people are not relating to it, you're going to lose them. And your world could be mega fantastic. But I mean, Harry Potter was brought up a couple of times. Harry Potter, I won't debate the pros, but the world that was created in Harry Potter is an interesting world, but that's not what pulls people to Harry Potter. It's the characters. And it's that they're so relatable, and they're going through relatable experiences like school, like issues with boyfriends and girlfriends, and all the things that we went through, being bullied, being misunderstood. Those are things that bring a strong emotional relationship. And then when the world is fascinating and amazing, like our world is, and that's something that I like to put in my writing all the time. We live in a fascinating, wonderful world. We don't, a lot of times we get ourselves just locked into very narrow viewpoints and perspectives, and we fail to see the wonder and amazement that's around us. And so I would just say, when you're writing, make sure that you're relating, and you need to be experiencing the world. You need to see the wonder and the fascinating things around you if you want to write it. Because if you can't see it out there, if all you see is dark and depressing, maybe you can write horror. I don't know, but I think it affects your world.
One thing I would think of too is the psychology of your characters. One of my novels, which I wrote 20 years ago, I came to revise and reissue, and I realized I hadn't understood the psychology of my main character. He was a political officer in a repressive regime, and by the end of the book, he'd actually developed a conscience and a heart. And I hadn't realized from the start that he actually had imposter syndrome. He was trying to act in a position that was not him, in ways that he was not psychologically, emotionally, that were not right for him. Once I realized that, I could rewrite it and make him a more believable person and have reasons for his actions. So I think knowing the psychology of your characters well is a good thing, and that would have, I think, having, and not doing that, rather, is one of the potholes that can really wreck a book.
Oh, my pothole is research. I could stay there all day. Oh my God. And then I'll see something cool and I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I chase it. And then I'm like, oh, I got this other story idea now. And I can build this other world based off of that thing. So you gotta stay focused. I think the biggest pothole of world building is how easily you can lose focus and start chasing other ideas. Especially when you're creative, you've always got people living in your head. And they all want their turn, and they all fight each other for attention. So make yourself a to-do list. I think another mistake that I see new writers do is they either try to build a world too big for their britches a little bit. First, practice storytelling, do some short stories, build that understanding of how you want to communicate with your readers a little bit, not writing style, and then try something a little bigger. And at the same point, I've also seen authors kill themselves for not writing down. Don't be afraid to take notes. I rarely remember my husband's phone number. Why am I going to remember what I named that society that sort of has something to do with the character's blood lineage, and that's the reason why he can grow wings on his back? Don't expect yourself to remember everything that you create either, and it's okay to write it down and let it go a little bit. And it's okay to change it later. Don't, because you put it on paper and originally thought the world wouldn't function A, B, C, and it actually functions E, G, Z, change it up and follow your gut a little bit. We were talking about instincts earlier in the beginning of this panel. Follow your instincts and gut, but write it down, set up a do and don't list of research for that story. If you find a good nugget, put it away someplace. Hide it, that is your carrot and your stick until you finish this book. And kind of entice yourself to keep that driven focus going. So that would be the potholes that I know that I did in the start. And I still have to remind myself, I'm like, oh, no, I've got to finish this book first.
I like that you're giving our audience hope that they can write multiple books.
Oh, yeah. Once you do it, you can't stop.
Yeah, yes.
I think one of the pitfalls for new writers, and you alluded to it, was the idea that they're trying to do everything at once. I like the iceberg method, when basically the writer needs to understand everything, but only 10% of that is going to be shown to the writer, to the reader. What I like to do, and I've pantsed books, and I've plotted extensively, and I've...
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Okay, pants writing, or by the seat of the pants, also known as discovery writer, is when you have a basic foggy idea and you sit down and just start writing and you kind of discover the story as you go. The problem, as Larry Brooks says, he wrote an excellent book everybody should get called Story Engineering, Larry Brooks. Essentially what happens is that you get lost in the sauce. You don't have any direction, and then you discover, oh, that's what the theme is. Oh, that's what... So it basically, discovery writer has to find the structure somewhere. And when you do strictly seat of the pants writing, you write 300,000 words and you got to make it into 100,000. Then you discover and figure out what the story really is. If you go at it with at least an idea of where you want to go, then that builds into your character who your character needs to be. You know, and whether you're plotting extensively, and even when I have plotted extensively, you're still going to discover all kinds of stuff. Things are going to come up that you didn't see when you plotted, and you're going to need to put it in, then you're going to have to back up, and then you say, well, I need to foreshadow this, and you go back to your first chapter to handle something that's going to come up in chapter 10. All that comes later. When you're writing the book, write it. Spit it out, even if it's ugly. If you have an idea where you want to go, that's going to make editing easier. So, you know, for me, the pitfall for me is that, what I think a lot of readers fail is that, writers fail, is that they fail to prepare. They don't really know who their character is, or where their world is, or what their idea is. If you have some idea, you have a guideline to work with. And, you know, I've gone to the point where I do complete psychological profiles of characters. I do their whole history, where they were born, what happened to them. In my book, Soul Harvest, I did all that for my character, Aggie Piper. And there was one flashback in that book which lasted a whole paragraph of less than 100 words, because I hate flashbacks too. But I made that flashback stick and be important in 100 words because I knew everything about it before it happened. So when this thing came up, basically there's people shooting, bullets are flying, and she freezes up. Why did she freeze up? Everything is cause and effect, cause and effect. If you, the writer, know what the effect is that you want, you can then back up and create causes, and then in editing modify it. I like to try to have pre-planned at least the chain of events. There's a good book I'll suggest, James Scott Bell. He's got a book out called Writing from the Middle. And what he does is figure out what the mirror moment is, that moment in the middle of the book when the character is facing himself and deciding what is he doing wrong, or you know, an important piece of information comes. So that's one way to do it. Or you can look at the end of the book, what you want to achieve, and then figure out a way to get there. And of course, then you have to figure out your character in the world and everything else. So it's, you know, you have to kind of pick your trajectory. And a lot of people don't. And like Larry Brooks says, writing by the seat of your pants is basically the process of discovering the structure, discovering the plot. If you kind of have an idea what that's going to be before you go in, it makes a lot less editing and a lot easier to get where you want to go. You know, and then for me, I back up and plug in whatever is missing. If I need some foreshadowing, if I need a metaphor, I can go back later for that, and I often do. Get the first draft, go back through it and say, here's a moment to foreshadow, I'll put that in. The reader doesn't know it, but I know it. So when the reader discovers this 10 chapters in, it's not a surprise, it's not a shock, it's already in the book. So,
I also tell new readers, they're like, wow, how do you sit down and you just like, it just all comes out, and I'm like, but I'm on like book 50, guys. I've ghostwritten, I've dabbled in typesetting, I've done tons of workshops, panels, assisted, mentored. I've dabbled for a while, nonstop. And it's almost like, muscles, right? When you first start running, good luck getting just to your front door, right? But then if you keep at it, you eventually can do that 1 mile, 5 mile, whatever run or goal that you have in mind. So when you're building your world and you're building your story, what you do know, write it down. Write that part. I don't care if you suddenly have to jump from chapter 2 to chapter 50 or the middle of the book. Get that scene out that you do know, because what you're doing is emptying the pickle jar a little bit, right? Can't make new pickles in another batch without emptying it out. Now, eventually your jar gets bigger, I promise you, and then when that happens, you're gonna hate me, and you're welcome. Because then now you've got like the big 5-gallon like thing, that a barrel, whatever they use it, or the 5-gallon buckets at the firehouse subs, you've seen them, you know what I'm talking about. So, but you start someplace, and you have to empty out, make room, because it's a muscle.
Good.
I was just going to say, I think that it has to be a mix, because structure can kill a book too. And if you are so fixed on the structure and there's no energy, there's no life, there's no connection in that story, then it's not going to work. But at the same time, seat of your pants, what was referred to as seat of your pants writing, that can be a way to get energy and to get life down. And then, as Ray Bradbury said, then you go back later and pour the critical cold water on it and fill in the structure. And in my mind, and every author works different. Some authors are going to start with structure, and then the characters come alive from that structure. Others are going to start from the character, and it's just living, and then the structure comes from that. But it's a mesh of the two, and if you're too far on either side, I think that can kill your world building, kill your story.
I would add one thing, and I learned this a long time ago by reading a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. It's a great trick. You load up everything technical on the left brain, and when you're in the read process, you pay no attention to it. You load it up, it's all in there, and when you start to write, you don't worry about it, you just write. You just say, well, I'm going to write a chapter today, and it's going to be about my character doing this. You just let it go. Load the left brain with all this knowledge, understand how it works, but as you're creating, you don't need to put that out there. I'm also a musician and an artist. When I pick up my guitar and play lead, I'm not thinking about notes and scales and chord tones. When I'm painting a picture, like all my book covers, I painted all those. Once I start, 5 hours goes by, and oh wow, I'm done. I don't think about it. All that information's been programmed in. My subconscious mind is doing the work. So it's important to keep learning the craft, understand the craft. You can write it any way you want, but at some point you have to understand how to edit it and make it work. And that's what structure is. No structure, no story.
That's good advice, but you have to have the knowledge to load up in the left brain first, and
which is easy to do.
you have to have the experience.
The books that I've mentioned, all great books for that.
Okay. All right, we're going to go into the hot take round. Each of you are going to have an opportunity to answer this question. Do you think there's been a recent shift in fantasy sci-fi world building? And what do you think modern audiences want to see? Start with you.
Oh, great, thanks. Well, I definitely think that there's been a shift. I think that because there's been a shift in our world. I think reality in our world has become very different through the COVID, through some of the things that we're experiencing with having a world community now has, and with the technology and how technology is ruling our lives, and how especially our kids are raised abbreviating life, LOL and whatever. And so I think that all of this is impacting our world, and so it's impacting our art. I don't know that it's always conscious. I think sometimes it's in the subconscious, but I think that connection is there, and so definitely there's a change. What our audience is looking for today, well, if I knew that perfectly, I would have my island in the sun. But I think I sat on a panel one time with a gal who wrote zombie books, and she's like, you know, I have a formula, I know the ending, I know the beginning, I just go through it, and I just do all these books, and that worked for her, and that was great for her, but that wouldn't work for me, because I write because I have something to say, and if I don't say something, then I feel like if I'm not making a connection with people and somehow changing their life or their viewpoint in some way because of what we've shared together, and them changing me as well, then I feel like the process isn't accomplishing what I entered writing to do. So that's kind of my viewpoint from that. So I feel like it's very important that we as writers are true to ourselves. And while there can be popular trends out there, it may not be what's true to you. And so I think that you have to be true to yourself. And if you're true to yourself and you connect with your audience, it's funny, but trends can change. And maybe, you know, what was today not the most popular thing is tomorrow going to be the most popular thing. So I think you can be chasing what's the most popular thing. I sat in one group where they were talking about putting formulas together from what people were viewing so they could figure out what's the most popular story, you know, thing to try to make a book about so that they could hit the popularity button. But I don't play those games. I just feel like you got to be true to yourself.
So you're basically saying my question is garbage.
I am not. I don't mean to say that. I am just saying that you got to be true.
Let's see if Andrew likes it better.
I'm not sure about that. And I may or may not be right on this, but I almost have the impression that nowadays people's attention span is much shorter, and so that the actual language in books tends to be more shorter, more concise, more faster paced than some of the like some of the science fiction I used to read when I was a kid, which, you know, you'd have longer sentences, more detailed paragraph, more exposition, and so I tend to think things are a bit more concise and fast paced now than they used to be.
Yeah, some of that 70s heavy sci-fi was dense,
Yeah.
for sure.
All that Pierce Ante and
Yeah.
Catherine. I love those books.
I know.
I'm rereading those now.
I get actually asked this question a lot, especially coming from so many angles of the industry. At the American Library Association this past summer, we talked about where fantasy and sci-fi, that was our presentation as a publisher. Back in the day of Tolkien, I don't know how much of you guys realize this, they had a hell of a time trying to convince the world and publishers that they are not I am not writing children's fiction. Fantasy was strictly considered children's books topic. Now it's changed, right? Now it's cool to be a nerd. It's cool to be into Star Wars and Star Trek and a Trekkie. Live long and prosper. You know, but I think something that fantasy and science fiction has always been great at, has always proven strong at, is changing with the reader much faster than any other genre. Right now, fantasy and science fiction, the books that I'm seeing come out, the nice African, like Children of Blood and Bone, if you have not listened to this book or read the book, the prose is beautiful and the African tone of it is amazing. amazing. It is very rich, but it's clearly fantasy. You also are seeing, you know, Priory of Orange Trees and LGBT titles really explore those elements as well. So they're bringing that diversity in much better in the fold than any other genre right now. And I can't wait to see what ends up. I mean, they've always been good at that because the first interracial relationship was Star Trek, with, you know, and they've always done that. The other thing and other aspect is, if you ask my personal opinion what the next big wave is going to be, it's science fiction subgenres. We're going to see an explosion of subgenres under science fiction that we haven't seen yet, and only have seen in romance and fantasy a little bit recently. And that's a subgenre of romance, a subgenre of post-apocalyptic science fiction or cyberpunk. We're going to see those subgenres come into the fold as a legit BICIC code and stand on their own in the libraries a little stronger than they've ever done in the past. They've got to start someplace, and that's usually an influence of readers and the writers who cater to them. There is nothing wrong with tropes. Trope writing is okay, and that's basically, oh, this is Hero's Journal. This is, you know, boy is enjoying life, comes back, village is destroyed, and now he must face the villain and go on a long quest of self-discovery. You know, Legend of Zelda, classic. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to write to trope. Hallmark proves that to us, right? Oh my God, as many, I am not a sweet romance Hallmark reader, writer, but sometimes me and my husband have been sitting there for 2 hours watching the Hallmark Channel, and we're like, how did we get here? Because they're feel good, there's an expectation, they know their reader, they know their audience. And it comes back to that aspect every time. Know your audience, know your readership. And sometimes you don't know. Nancy Springer. If you guys are not familiar with Nancy Springer, she writes Enola Holmes. She's got Netflix series. It's a wonderful little middle grade teen, you know, murder mystery thing. If you talk to Nancy Springer, which I've had to help her with her Twitter account, she will tell you, I write fantasy and they keep sending me these Agatha awards all the time, and I don't get it. You know, she jokes about it all the time, but she sat down and she wrote what she felt at heart was a fantasy story, and look where it got her. But at the end of the day, she trusted her editor and publisher and marketer, said, baby, your audience, the readers who would love this and will give you the feedback and the respect and resonate with the story best are over here. And you, at the end of the day, because you didn't think you wrote a romance and you ended up writing a romance, be okay with that, okay? And kind of trust the people out there.
Rachel?
Oh, I think what's new and improved is the idea that I think prose is generally better, it's more succinct, but also in the modern market today, it used to be an idea story was enough. You didn't have to have great characters. Now you have to have a great idea and a great character. But it's not enough. Now you gotta mix in maybe some humor, maybe some romance. Today, a lot of fiction has multi-levels in it that weren't there previously. It usually, especially in science fiction, focus on an idea story and maybe some of the characterization. Some sci-fi stories had good characterization, others didn't matter an awful lot. Today, I think in sci-fi and fantasy, the reader is wanting deeper levels and more levels as far as what the reader wants from a book, because readers are more sophisticated today, better educated. As far as trends are concerned, I mean, that's a trend, a literary trend, and of course literary trends change with time. That's why we have more succinct writing now compared to the 19th century, or the 50s, or the 70s. It's just the trend of how prose has been accepted in the public. The trend as far as ideas are concerned, well, idea stories have always been. Every story is an idea story on some level. And there's nothing new under the sun. It's a repackaging of many ideas. There's only 365 known plots to exist in the world. Pick one and write a story. It's how the stories are written, and also the focus that writers are putting on or in the situation of the story. Here's our idea or our ideal, And this is how we are going to express it. The modern reader wants a touch of romance, a touch of this, a touch of that. You gotta mix it all in. It's in there, it's the spaghetti sauce.
All right, it's the hot take round.
Oh, well, one more. The trend, I don't follow the trends. Because I write what makes me laugh. I write what entertains me, and I hope that it entertains others. I write for the reader. And if it's gonna make me laugh, it's gonna make you laugh.
30 seconds. Give us one thing that you want people in the audience to take away from today's discussion, and give us your latest work. Give us your pitch on your latest work, or where we can find you.
rctom.com is, you can go there, look at my website. It tells you a little bit about my books. I'll pass out cards. There's a free short story there. It's called The Jesus Probe. That's about two alien planet molders who are in trouble with management. They go down to Earth to stop religion, and instead they create one. So that's the kind of stuff that cracks me up. And so I do a lot of that. I also do some serious fiction. My new book, which is called Book of Answers, is about an immortal who's a hippie that came up out of Haight-Ashbury, the ideal human being. He's here on the planet to save humanity, but he doesn't know that because he lost his memory. And the intelligent designer at the center of the universe is trying to find him, but she's insane. So she sends a couple of characters down to look for him. They can't find him either. They got 10 million years to find this guy, and if it doesn't, that's the end of humanity. Meanwhile, it's really a story of human de-evolution. And I paint a picture of what the world's going to look like in 10 million years. And where it looks like all along the way, and every aspect of de-evolution you can think of is in there. I've got lizards that are now dogs. So, yeah, it's cockamamie, tongue-in-cheek, and there's some serious ideas in there, too.
Piece of advice I hope you guys walk away with is don't give up. Don't give up. And you're not gonna, it's gonna change as you write it. But the sooner you get out of your head, the easier it gets. And the first book might take you 12 years, the next one 3, and then before you know it, you're writing a book in a month. Because you've learned yourself and your characters and worlds building much better. Let's see, most recent publication is coming out this summer. It's going to be exclusive on Yonder, which is a web novel app through Naver and Webtoons. And that is a origin story of the older brother to this main character, Dante. In short, the world is evolving, there's invaders, they've taken over ruling the Grandmere, and him and the heir apparent of the former emperor team up to kind of try to figure out how they can stop it, the corruption from happening and destroying everyone and everything they love. And that's a male-male romance. Let's see. And you can find me on willisauthor.com, anywhere you see Willis Author on Instagram, Facebook. I am on TikTok doing dumb things all the time and telling you guys stories of crazy things that happen in my life and where I'm about and what my latest stories are. So.
Things I would recommend, one is beginning with short stories, as somebody mentioned. The second is that once you've written that novel, is stick it on the shelf for a few months. Let it brew, let your subconscious work on it, and then come back to it later. I've looked at things that I wrote 20 years ago, and I can't imagine how bad they were. And some of them are resurrectable and some aren't. But let it sit for a while and then come back to it later. I've got my website, andrewm7.com, also on Blogspot. Upcoming projects have nothing to do with science fiction. I have a second book of German Shepherd stories coming out to benefit animal rescuers, and I also have a book on tips for writers coming out, hopefully in the next couple of months, called Dr. Andrew's Curious Compendium, based on some articles I wrote for magazines over the next few years. After that, I have a series, hopefully I can get finished, about the adventures of a British World War I veteran with his German Shepherd who encounters a lot of supernatural, paranormal, weird things around the world.
That sounds very interesting. Dean, go.
Well, the piece of advice I would give is I don't think life is about making your dreams come true. I think it's about having the courage to dream dreams that make the life that you should be living true. So that would be what I would leave with you. You can find me on Amazon. You can find me on deanfarrell.com and several other places online. I am just finishing the 5th and final book in the Cryptic Spaces series. That's going to be out later this year. And that's it. Thank you.
Give a big hand to all our panelists. You guys did an excellent job. Thank you so much for your time today, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now I make sure to.
Hey, let's give a hand to our moderator.